Okay, our next speaker is going to provide a European perspective. Elmer Schabel is a clinical assessor at the Drug Regulatory Authority in Germany. He was recently appointed chair of the GI drafting group in the European Medicines Agency, where he's in charge of the preparation of scientific guidelines in the field of gastroenterology and hepatology. Thank you very much for being here today.
Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here, invited to this important meeting and to give you an introduction into the European perspectives of the topics discussed here. Now, as you already can see on this slide, above we have the BfArM and down below we have the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. Therefore, sorry, this was the wrong button. Which one is it? Upside down. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Therefore, the first topic to discuss very briefly, I hope, is to give you an introduction into the EU regulatory network, and then introduce you into the current concepts for approval of new active substances, namely the guideline that is in operation. And then I go on to specific problems that were asked in the scientific advice procedure that we provide for future applicants. Now, this gives you a brief introduction into characteristics of the European Medicines Agency. And to keep it short, the EMA is a networking agency for European experts, and the evaluations and decisions are usually taken by scientific committees, of which the most important is the CHMP, and which I will not characterize further for the sake of time, but you have some facts about it here on the slide. And the next slide shows you the current structure of working groups and parties that are working with and in support of this CHMP and of EMA. And of most importance for our IBS topic and for myself, as the introduction was already given, are, of course, the gastroenterology drafting group here and the scientific advice working party, which deals with the company proposal for drug development programs. So, to go on to the guideline, this is in operation since 2003 without major changes, and I just have displayed the main topics the guideline deals with. Now going into the details. This guideline has as a main feature taking account of the waxing and waning characteristics of IBS, with the possibility that a drug development program can either be designed for a proposed repeated short-term treatment or the usual long-term continuous treatment. These possibilities do in fact require different development strategies and a different program after all, but do not mean that they are mutually exclusive. Of note is the fact that for short-term treatment, 2 subsequent short-term treatment cycles are to be documented, among other studies and features, and that for a long-term treatment, a randomized trial of 6 months duration is required. Now, coming to the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the guideline recommends the representation of all levels of care within the trial population, both genders to be represented in appropriate numbers to allow a meaningful overall risk conclusion. And it is also requested that from a pharmacological rationale for subgrouping, that a rationale should be given for the subgrouping. And it mentions explicitly the Rome II criteria as acceptable inclusion criteria. Exclusion of certain patient groups corresponding to the known red flags and other features are also mentioned. Now, coming to the endpoints, the guideline requests two co-primary endpoints. namely the combination of a global assessment of all symptoms and the assessment of abdominal pain and discomfort without a more clear specification. Whatever the choice of the endpoint, it requests a justification for the choice done and of the clinical relevance. It explicitly also states that the scales used to characterize global well-being and abdominal pain should be sensitive to deterioration, and they should be validated, of course. It recommends, but does not compulsorily require, a responder analysis based on a priori defined mean change in the scores. It mentions that the responder should be defined on clinical meaningful lists, and it also mentions the need for a specification of the time necessary to achieve the response in order to be defined as such. Usually, the 50% is interpreted as it would mean that a patient that is a responder in the first 2 weeks of a 4-week period and not in the last 2 weeks would not be considered a responder. Now, the secondary endpoints are given as the ones that are included in the inclusion criteria and are the common IBS symptoms that we all know, depending on which subgroup is meant to be treated. And, of course, a justification referring to the subgrouping is required for the choice of secondary endpoints. It also mentions that a main secondary endpoint is considered to be the evaluation of quality of life. Now, coming to the third part of my presentation, these are questions that have been posed by companies to the Scientific Advice Working Party, and I give you some examples for IBS development programs and the specific questions. The first of these questions was and is whether an endpoint that has, from a historic perspective, been used most often in trials for IBS during the last decade would still be acceptable. As you may all be familiar with the controversy around this question, I will just briefly tell you the current solution to this problem. The European regulatory attitude usually is to accept a binary evaluation on the overall symptom still, but not for the pain discomfort primary endpoint. There we would insist on a more diverse explanation of the change and the symptoms. Now, the next question is, of course, relating to the change of their own diagnostic criteria, and this has been brought up the question whether the new criteria would also be acceptable for a patient population to be included in drug development programs. This is also viewed with flexibility, and both Rome 2 and 3 criteria are usually considered to be acceptable. However, a consistent approach is required throughout a drug development program. Subgrouping itself is not seen as a problem, at least as long as a global IBS claim is made. We were actually not confronted with the problems of, are there differences in the subgroups, and what would this mean to the development program up to now. The next slide takes us to a real unresolved problem. How should the requested repeated short-term efficacy studies, if claimed, be conducted? In fact, apart from the one Tegezerot trial, a 4-week repeated treatment duration has not been investigated since. Each of these models that are displayed here may have disadvantages. In case of Tegezerot model, it is, a waste of patient from the first treatment period, and it's a complicated mode of evaluation for all the subgroups you have in the end. And currently, I would prefer the latter possibility 3 that has never been tried out before, but which was recently recommended to a company as a possibility for for a future drug development program. This has been somehow adopted from, let's say, on-demand treatment schemes in GERD and things like that, where you could just, treat people for a fixed first period and then see what is happening and just count good and bad days, which has to be elaborated further, of course, what this means and how this is being measured. Now, the next problem takes us partly back to the global perspective of this conference and to a more philosophical kind of question. Are continents or different regions of the world at all relevant to the play of chance? The question is whether the different requirements of FDA and European regulators regarding the primary endpoint would need an adjustment for multiplicity regarding the type 1 error. As you can see, the question is only partly resolved at the moment, and it will certainly be raised again if discrepant results between the continents are reported, which is hopefully not the case. Now, this slide takes us to a further unresolved question. According to the guidelines applicable worldwide, a company, or let's say in the 3 regions that are represented here, has to be documented with 300 to 600 patients for 6 months and 100 patients for 1 year if an unrestricted treatment duration claim is made. But how to deal with such a claim in an intended treatment scenario of repeated short-term treatment? Regarding this, the current attitude is that a documentation of 2 treatment cycles of 4 weeks duration each is clearly not sufficient. However, further criteria need to be developed. The next slide takes us to a problem that has been virulent for a long time already. How do we define a minimally clinically relevant differences? And this relates to 2 problems. The first one, what is a minimally clinically relevant difference for a scale that will be developed and is developed? Hopefully this is usually resolved within the development program of such a scale, but it also relates to the overall responder rates. And just to give you an example, the 10 to 15% superiority over placebo for tegaserot was not deemed to be sufficient for this substance. Now, this is, of course, something that is always dependent on overall risk and benefit, and therefore maybe a clear solution is not possible to this problem. The next slide also comes back to the perspective of the conference, and my colleague from Japan has already introduced you to ICH-E5 guideline, and it just shows you that usually there is acceptance of data from North America for Europe based on similarities that are obvious between the 2 regions. And we only have one example where we were asked previously whether a transfer of data from Asia would be possible. And this was denied not only because of the region being so different, as we heard yesterday, but also for the type of the product that was asked for, being a probiotic. Now, already coming to my last slide, this gives you some perspectives that might be necessary. There is an identified need for the development and validation of scales, as we have heard this morning, including the measurement of severity used as endpoints and for biomarkers regarding the condition. There may be a need to come to a consensus regarding minimally clinically important differences, and more thought should be spent on the development of designs for repeated treatment cycle trials. And the European regulators are requested, and this was one of the purpose for myself to come here to reflect on the need to revise our IBS guideline document and whether general guidance on patient-reported outcomes in Europe would also be desirable. Thank you very much for listening.